You tell yourself you're done trying to understand them. Done replaying their mixed signals at 2 a.m., done staring at a message thread that ended in coldness, distance, or a silence so sharp it felt personal. Done wondering how someone could hold your face in their hands one week, then act like your absence barely grazes them the next. Done asking the question that has been burning a hole through your dignity. If they felt something real, how can they act so heartless? And that is where the confusion begins to poison you. Because what breaks people like you is not always rejection. Sometimes it is ambiguity. Sometimes it is the terrifying possibility that what you felt was real, and they still walked away. They still went cold. They still withheld warmth like it cost them blood. And your mind cannot make peace with that, because love, to you, means moving closer. It means clarity. It means reassurance. It means, I'm here. I choose you. I'm not going anywhere. But to someone with avoidant patterns, love does not always feel like safety. Sometimes it feels like danger. That is the brutal truth no one tells you. The more they felt, the more their system may have panicked. The deeper the connection became, the more their body started interpreting intimacy like a threat. Not because you were too much, not because your love was wrong, but because closeness began touching wounds they buried under control, independence, and emotional distance. So while you were moving toward connection, they were fighting for oxygen. And when an avoidant person feels overwhelmed, they often do the one thing that looks the most cruel. They disconnect. Not always because they stopped caring, but because caring became unbearable. That's the part that twists the knife. Because from the outside, their detachment looks clean, calculated, almost inhuman. Their face goes blank, their voice gets flatter, their messages get shorter. Their warmth evaporates so completely that you start doubting whether it was ever there. And yet, inside them, something far less elegant is happening. Their nervous system is firing alarms. Their amygdala is reading intimacy as exposure. Their body begins flooding with stress chemistry, with cortisol, with the ancient signal that says, "Get out before this costs you your freedom, your control, your self-protection." And because they were never taught how to stay present inside emotional intensity, they do not soften. They go numb. Numbness is often mistaken for indifference. But numbness is not peace. It is overload wearing a mask. That is why the person who once seemed deeply drawn to you can suddenly become distant, irritated, overly logical, hard to reach, even cold enough to make you feel disposable. Their dopamine was happy when the connection felt stimulating, mysterious, exciting, safely unfinished. But once the bond started asking for emotional consistency, for vulnerability, for truth, their body no longer felt the rush of pursuit. It felt the weight of being known. And for someone organized around avoidance, being known can feel dangerously close to being trapped, consumed, disappointed, or exposed. So they do something devastating. They make you carry the pain they cannot metabolize. They pull away, and you are left holding the ache. You watch them act fine, maybe even lighter, more casual, more available to everyone except you. And that's the moment your self-worth starts negotiating with crumbs. Because your heart wants to believe that if you just say the right thing, give the right space, show the right patience, they will come back into the warmth you felt in the beginning. But here is the truth that changes everything. Their coldness is not proof you meant nothing. Very often, it is proof you touched something real enough to disturb the architecture of their defenses. People do not shut down that hard over what they truly feel nothing for. They shut down when something matters enough to destabilize them. Now listen carefully, because this is where most people ruin themselves. The moment they sense the avoidant slipping away, they rush in harder. More texts, more explanations, more emotional generosity, more efforts to prove they are safe, understanding, different. They try to love the fear out of someone who has spent years surviving by controlling distance. And without realizing it, they create the exact pressure that makes the avoidant retreat further. Not because love is wrong, but because pursuit feels like invasion to a dysregulated nervous system. This is why the core concept you need to understand is silence. Not performative silence, not manipulative silence, not the fake kind where you disappear only to make someone panic. Real silence, regulated silence. The kind that happens when you stop chasing answers from someone who can only offer you fragments. The kind that begins when you finally realize your pain has been talking louder than your power. Silence is where the dynamic changes. Because while your reaction once gave them relief, your stillness gives them reflection. When you keep reaching, they do not have to feel the full shape of your absence. Your messages become an emotional buffer. Your longing softens the consequences of their distance. Your availability protects them from loss. It lets them stay half invested without confronting what your presence actually meant. But when you become still, not bitter, not cruel, just unavailable to the cycle, something shifts inside them. The noise stops. And suddenly there is room for them to hear themselves. That is when the avoidant mind often starts doing something ironic. The person who pulled away to escape intensity starts feeling haunted by what is no longer there. The good morning texts they found overwhelming become strangely absent. The emotional depth they once resisted becomes difficult to replace. The softness they acted too burdened to hold begins to echo in ordinary moments. Driving home, standing in line, waking up in a quiet room, reaching for their phone and remembering you are no longer there to steady the emptiness. This is the part people misunderstand. They assume avoidant people feel nothing after the disconnect because they do not emote the way anxious hearts do. But many avoidant people process loss in reverse. First comes relief, then comes curiosity, then comes the subtle ache, then comes the memory, then comes the delayed impact of what they pushed away. Because once the pressure of closeness is gone, the feeling they were defending against has space to surface. And that feeling is often love mixed with fear. Not mature, available love, not always, but real attachment, real significance, real missing. Picture them in the first days after pulling away. They tell themselves they needed space. They feel justified, clearer, back in control. Their breathing is easier because the emotional demand has lowered. They distract, they scroll, they work. They flirt with detachment like it's freedom, and for a moment, it works. Then the silence deepens, and in that silence, they start reaching for mental traces of you. The way you looked at them without armor, the way you noticed the sadness behind their sarcasm, the way your presence asked for nothing fake, the way you made intimacy feel possible, and therefore terrifying. They remember things they could not feel while they were inside the overwhelm. This is when the power dynamic quietly flips, not because you learned a trick, because you stopped interrupting reality. You stopped throwing your nervous system at a wall and calling it love. You stopped volunteering your heart to decode someone who benefits from your confusion. You stopped performing understanding while betraying yourself. And that withdrawal of emotional labor forces a confrontation they were avoiding all along: what your absence actually feels like. Then comes the obsession no one sees. Not always loud, not always dramatic. Avoidant obsession is often invisible. It looks like checking your profile and pretending it means nothing, starting conversations in their head they never send, comparing every new person to the emotional intensity they lost with you, feeling irritated that you seem okay, feeling drawn toward you the moment you stop reaching, rereading old messages when loneliness hits at night, wondering whether you've moved on, whether you finally saw through them, whether they miscalculated and let go of someone they may never be able to replace. Because what they called too much was often the very thing that made them feel alive. They just didn't know how to stay open long enough to receive it. And this is where your transformation begins. Because the old version of you would hear this and think, good, so if I go silent, they'll come back. But the stronger version of you hears something deeper. If they come back without doing inner work, they come back with the same nervous system, the same defenses, the same reflex to punish closeness once it starts feeling real again. That is the warning. Do not confuse longing with capacity. Do not confuse missing you with being able to love you well. Do not confuse their return with your healing. Because some people come back not because they are ready, but because your absence reactivated their attachment. They miss access. They miss the way you regulated their loneliness. They miss the mirror you held up, the tenderness, the attention, the emotional gravity. And for a while, that can look like revelation. They text, they soften, they admit they were overwhelmed. They say they never stopped thinking about you. And maybe they're telling the truth. But truth without transformation still bleeds you. If the pattern remains untouched, the cycle repeats. Closeness, panic, distance. Your confusion, their shutdown. Your grief, their delayed longing. Another return, another collapse. Another season of you calling pain by softer names so you do not have to face what it is costing you. This is why your real power was never in making them chase. It was in becoming someone who no longer needs to be chased to feel chosen. Read that again in your bones. Your power is not in becoming unforgettable to the one who fears intimacy. Your power is in refusing to abandon yourself while waiting to be properly loved. Your power is in understanding the psychology without letting it become an excuse for your starvation. Your power is in looking at someone's coldness and saying, I believe you are overwhelmed. I believe you may even care deeply. And I still refuse to build a home inside your inability to stay. That is self-worth. Self-worth is not loud. It does not beg to be seen. It does not perform detachment for revenge. It does not weaponize silence. It simply stops kneeling in front of inconsistency and calling it fate. And strangely, this is often the exact moment they feel you most. When your energy is no longer wrapped around their ambivalence, when your attention is no longer feeding the bond alone, when your nervous system stops organizing itself around their unpredictability, when the version of you they expected to wait disappears. That is when they realize your love was not ordinary. Because ordinary attention is easy to find, but emotionally attuned presence, tenderness with depth, someone who saw through the defenses and still cared, that is rare. And once it is gone, the avoidant heart often feels the loss in a language it can no longer dismiss. Through restlessness, through regret, through the strange emptiness of getting exactly the distance they thought they wanted. This does not mean you should secretly hope for their pain. That is not healing. And it does not mean every avoidant person is secretly in love. Some are simply unavailable. Some are disconnected from themselves beyond what love alone can reach. Some will miss you and still choose the familiar prison of distance. That is their work, not yours. But if someone acts heartless after real intimacy, do not be too quick to assume your value was imaginary. Sometimes heartless is a shield. Sometimes coldness is panic with perfect posture. Sometimes detachment is what overwhelmed people do when they do not have the capacity to stay soft under pressure. Sometimes the cruelest behavior comes from the deepest fear of needing. And yes, sometimes they pull away because they feel more than they know how to hold. But your healing begins when that truth stops seducing you into waiting. Let it clarify you instead. Let it free you from the lie that if you were more lovable, more patient, more understanding, they would have stayed. No. Your love may have been the very thing that exposed the fracture. Your depth may have activated every defense they had. Your warmth may have reached a part of them they have spent years outrunning. That is not failure. That is impact. And now you must decide what to do with that knowledge. You can keep making their fear your responsibility. You can keep translating silence into hope, coldness into hidden devotion, breadcrumbs into prophecy. You can keep spending your life inside the almost. Or you can become the kind of person who understands the wound without stepping inside it. The kind of person who no longer confuses chemistry with safety. The kind of person who no longer chases closure from emotionally defended people. The kind of person who can love deeply without bargaining away their dignity. The kind of person whose nervous system no longer mistakes instability for passion. The kind of person who does not need someone else's delayed realization to confirm their worth. Because here is the final shift. The moment you stop asking, how do I make them feel what they lost? You begin asking, why was I ever willing to lose myself just to be felt? And that question changes everything. It changes the way you text, the way you wait, the way you interpret silence, the way you respond to mixed signals, the way you walk away from people who can feel deeply but love poorly. You stop trying to be unforgettable. You become unavailable for emotional half-love. You become unavailable for relationships that require you to shrink your needs until they look reasonable to someone terrified of intimacy. You become unavailable for one-sided emotional labor. You become unavailable for the fantasy that if you endure enough confusion, it will eventually become commitment. And in that refusal, something sacred returns to you. your center. Your body softens. Your mind clears. The obsession breaks. The ache stops being an altar. You remember who you were before someone else's inconsistency became your internal weather. You remember that being loved should not feel like decoding a locked room. You remember that your heart is not desperate. It is devoted. And devotion belongs in places where it can breathe. So if they acted heartless, maybe it did reveal something. Maybe it revealed how overwhelmed they were by what they felt. Maybe it revealed how unprepared they were for real intimacy. Maybe it revealed that your presence mattered more than they could comfortably admit. But more importantly, let it reveal something about you. Let it reveal that you can survive being misunderstood, that you can survive not being chosen by someone who cannot choose themselves, that you can survive the silence without making it mean you are unlovable, that you can walk away from a connection that touched your soul and still keep your soul. Because your worth does not rise and fall with their capacity. Your power does not come from being the one they finally realize they loved. Your power comes from realizing, before they ever do, that you were never meant to beg for the kind of love that has to disappear to recognize your value. And once you know that, deeply know that, in your body, not just your mind, the whole pattern begins to collapse. You stop chasing. You stop explaining. You stop proving. You stop translating coldness into hope. And you become something the old version of you could barely imagine. Peaceful. Clear. Untouchable in the ways that matter. Not because you no longer feel, but because you finally understand that the deepest form of power is not making someone obsessed with losing you. It is becoming someone who would rather lose them than lose themselves.